My brother stood at my mother's funeral and cried harder than anyone in that room. He held my hand. He told me we only had each other now. He told me family was everything. 3 weeks later, I found out he had already forged her signature on documents that transferred her entire estate into his name alone. I had been erased before she was even in the ground. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake for months, was that this was not the first thing he had taken from me. It was just the first time I had proof. Before I tell you what I found and what I did with it, I need to ask you something real. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you would have taken a bullet for? Someone who knew exactly how much you trusted them and used that trust like a weapon? If you have, stay with me, because what Sarah did next was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it was the most powerful thing she had ever done in her life. Drop a comment right now. Would you have forgiven him, or would you have burned it all down? I want to know where you stand before this story ends. My name is Sarah, and I want to tell you about the person who knew me better than almost anyone on this earth. The person who watched me grow up, who shared a home with me, who sat across from me at every birthday dinner and every holiday table. My brother Daniel. He was 4 years older than me. He was charming. He was the kind of person who made everyone in a room feel like they were his best friend. He had a laugh that filled up a hallway. And for most of my life, I thought loving him was one of the safest things I could do. I was wrong, and the unraveling of that belief nearly destroyed me, but it also rebuilt me into someone I actually like. This is not a story about a monster. Daniel was not a movie villain. He did not twirl a mustache. He did not announce his intentions. He was subtle. He was patient. He used real love, the love I had for him, as the quietest weapon imaginable. He learned what I would excuse. He learned what I would believe. And then he planned around those things for years before I even noticed a single crack. Let me take you back to where it started. Not where I first noticed something was wrong, but where the damage actually began, because those two moments were years apart, and that gap is the whole story. I grew up in a house where money was talked about in whispers. My parents were not rich, but they were careful. My mother, especially, was someone who understood the weight of financial security in a way that only people who had once lacked it could understand. She had grown up without much. She had worked her whole adult life to build something stable. By the time Daniel and I were teenagers, there was a paid-off home, a modest savings account, and a small piece of land about 40 minutes outside the city that had been in our family for 2 generations. My mother always said the land was for both of us. Not Daniel, not Sarah, both. Daniel was the older one, and from the beginning he acted like that fact carried weight. He made decisions without consulting me. He volunteered my mother's time without asking her. He introduced himself at family gatherings as though he ran the household. My parents were gentle people, and they never really pushed back on any of it. They believed in keeping the peace. I believed in keeping the peace too. It was the environment we were raised in. But Daniel learned something in that environment that I did not learn. He learned that in this family, silence equaled permission. When I was 23, I got married. His name was Marcus. I loved Marcus, and I believed Marcus loved me. My mother adored him. My father, who passed away the year before our wedding from a heart condition he had hidden from all of us, had met Marcus twice and called him steady. That word, steady, meant everything coming from my father. Daniel was my husband's best man. He gave a toast at the wedding that made half the room cry. He talked about me like I was the most precious person in his world. He said Marcus better spend the rest of his life making sure I was happy, or he would personally have something to say about it. Everyone laughed. I beamed. My mother held a handkerchief to her face. I think about that toast sometimes. I think about the way Daniel smiled when he delivered it. I wonder now how much of it he believed, and how much of it was a performance for an audience he needed to impress. The first year of my marriage was quiet and sweet. Marcus and I settled into a small apartment across town. We were both working, building, saving. Life felt like it was moving in the right direction. Daniel had his own apartment, his own life, a long-term girlfriend named Priya who I genuinely liked. And then the first small, strange thing happened. Marcus came home one evening looking unsettled. He did not bring it up at dinner. He waited until we were getting ready for bed, and then he said something like, "Your brother called me today." I was surprised because Daniel almost never called Marcus directly. They were friendly but not close in that way. I asked what he wanted. Marcus paused for a moment and said Daniel had asked him about our finances. Specifically, he had asked whether Marcus thought we would be in a position to help their mother financially if she ever needed it. I did not think much of it at the time. I interpreted it as concern. Daniel loved our mother. I assumed he was thinking ahead, being responsible, checking in. I told Marcus we would cross that bridge when we came to it, and I made a mental note to bring it up with Daniel myself. But when I brought it up with Daniel, he acted like the conversation had never happened. He was warm, he was casual, he redirected immediately to something else, and within 90 seconds I had forgotten what I had even walked into the room to say. That was a skill he had. That was always a skill he had. The second strange thing happened about 8 months later. My mother called me and mentioned, very casually, that Daniel had suggested she update her will. She said it like she was telling me about a grocery run. I asked her what she meant. She explained that Daniel had been spending more time with her since Marcus and I had gotten busy with work and life, and that he had mentioned to her that her documents were probably outdated and she should look at them. I told her that was probably a good idea. I even thanked him in my head for being thoughtful. I cannot express to you how much I regret that instinct. I want to be very clear about something before this story goes further. I am not telling you I was stupid. I am telling you I was trusting. There is a difference, even though people who have never been betrayed by a sibling often cannot see it. When someone is your family, when you have shared everything with them, when you have seen them at their most human and most vulnerable, you extend to them a level of charity that you would not extend to a stranger. You fill in the gaps with the best possible explanation. You assume love, you assume goodness. You assume that the person who cried at your wedding would never be quietly dismantling the floor beneath your feet. That assumption is exactly what Daniel counted on. Life moved on. My mother began to have some health issues around the time I was 26. Nothing immediately terrifying, blood pressure, some fatigue, a diagnosis of early arthritis that slowed her down more than any of us wanted to admit. She was still sharp. She still drove herself to appointments. But she needed more help around the house, and Daniel had moved back to the same neighborhood she lived in, which meant he was there more than I was. I was grateful for it. I genuinely was. I visited as often as I could, but my work schedule was demanding, Marcus had his own long hours, and Daniel had always been good with her in a hands-on way. He fixed things. He ran errands. He sat with her on the porch. I told myself we were a team. I told myself we were both doing what we could. What I did not see was that during that time, Daniel was doing something else entirely. He was building a version of events. He was constructing, very slowly and very carefully, a narrative in which he was the devoted child and I was the distant one. He told my mother things, not lies exactly, but framed truths. He mentioned more than once that I had been too busy to call. He mentioned that Marcus and I were always traveling, always focused on ourselves. He said these things gently, lovingly, in a tone that said he was not criticizing, just noticing. My mother was not a foolish woman, but she was a lonely one after my father died. And loneliness makes people want to believe in the person who is physically present. Daniel was there. I was a phone call. In her mind, I think the gap between those two things quietly widened over time in ways she never fully articulated to me. I found out about this later. I found out from things she had written, and from something a neighbor said, and from a voicemail Daniel left on her phone that I was not supposed to hear. But I am getting ahead of myself. The first real alarm, the one that should have sent me running but instead sent me into a spiral of self-doubt, happened when my mother was hospitalized for the first time. She had a cardiac episode. Nothing fatal, but serious enough that she was admitted for 3 days. I drove 2 hours to get there the same night I found out. I sat with her. I held her hand. I cried in the hallway. I called her doctors. I arranged for a home health aide to visit twice a week when she was discharged. I was as present as I knew how to be. Daniel was also there. And at some point during that hospital stay, he pulled me aside in the corridor and said something that I have replayed 1,000 times since. He said, "Mom and I have been talking about the future, about what happens to everything. I just want you to know that I'm handling it." I looked at him and I said, "Handling what?" He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't worry about the details, Sarah. I'm taking care of it. That's all you need to know." I was exhausted. I was scared about my mother. I was in the fluorescent-lit chaos of a hospital corridor. I said, okay. I thought he meant funeral planning, medical directives, the kind of heavy future thinking that an emergency forces you to confront. I thought he was trying to protect me. He was not protecting me. 3 months after my mother was discharged from the hospital, she was well enough to be home, but not well enough to live entirely independently. We set her up with more support. Daniel was helping coordinate. I was visiting on weekends and handling some financial management for her utilities and medications remotely. During this time, I noticed something odd. My mother's bank statements, which I occasionally helped her review, showed a new account linked to her name. I asked her about it. She seemed confused at first, and then she said Daniel had opened it for her. She said it was for convenience. I asked what kind of convenience. She could not fully explain it, but she was not worried, and she asked me please not to make a fuss. I did not make a fuss. I should have made a fuss. That account, I would later discover, was not opened purely for her convenience. It was the beginning of a financial restructuring that Daniel had been planning in layers. Small moves, invisible moves. The kind of moves that only reveal themselves when you lay all the pieces side by side. But I was not laying pieces side by side yet. I was still handing Daniel my trust, one increment at a time, because he was my brother, and I did not yet understand what he had decided to become. Let me tell you about Marcus for a moment, because he matters to this story more than it might seem. Marcus is a quiet man. He was raised in a family where conflict was handled directly and where you looked someone in the eye and said what you meant. He was never entirely comfortable with Daniel. Not hostile, Marcus was far too measured for hostility, but watchful. He had a way of going quiet in certain conversations and then asking me later, in bed with the lights off, whether something about that interaction had struck me as unusual. I always had an answer ready. I always explained Daniel away. Marcus never argued, but he kept a kind of internal tally that he never showed me. He told me later, when everything was out in the open, that he had been watching Daniel for years and that he had not said more because he knew how much I needed to believe in him. Marcus said he loved me too much to take that belief away before I was ready to let go of it myself. That broke my heart a little, the good kind of breaking. But long before Marcus and I had that conversation, things got much worse. My mother passed away when I was 31. It was not sudden, she had been declining for about 14 months, but when it happened, it still felt like the ground opened up. She was the last parent I had. She was the center of a gravity that I had orbited my entire life. Her absence was a particular kind of silence that I did not know how to fill. Daniel was at the hospital when she passed. I was there too. We drove separately to her house afterward and sat at her kitchen table and did not say very much. He made tea. I stared at her handwriting on a grocery list that was still stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Bananas, low-fat yogurt, bread. He held my hand when I cried. He told me we only had each other now. He said family was everything. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from an attorney I had never heard of. The letter informed me that I was not listed as a beneficiary in my mother's most recent will. It stated that the estate, including the family home and the land, had been left in its entirety to my brother, Daniel. It informed me that the will had been signed and notarized 14 months prior, during the period when my mother had been ill, before her first hospitalization, at a point when her health was declining, but her formal diagnosis had not yet been made. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office and read that letter 3 times. Then I called Marcus. Then I called Daniel. Daniel picked up on the second ring. His voice was warm. He said he had been meaning to call me. He said he was sorry about how everything had come out. He said he hoped I understood. He said our mother had made her wishes clear and he had simply helped her document them. He said families were complicated and he hoped this would not come between us. He said he loved me. I did not scream. I did not cry on the phone. Something cold and very still settled inside me, and I said, "I'll talk to you soon, Daniel," and I ended the call. That coldness saved me. The next morning, I contacted an estate attorney of my own. Her name was Patricia, and she was exactly what I needed: sharp, direct, unhurried. I brought her the letter. I told her what I knew. I told her what I suspected. She listened to everything with her hands folded on the desk, and then she said, Tell me about your mother's condition in the 14 months before she passed. And so I did. Patricia asked me to compile everything I could: medical records, dates of doctor appointments, any communication between Daniel and my mother that I had access to, any financial documents I could legally obtain. She was not promising me anything. She was very clear about that. But she was also clear that the circumstances I was describing, a will signed during a period of documented health decline, without the knowledge of another adult child, with a single primary beneficiary who had also been managing daily finances, were the kinds of circumstances that warranted a closer look. I went home that night and I started going through everything I had. What I found over the next 2 weeks changed the shape of the entire story I had been telling myself for years. The first thing I found was a folder of bank statements I had kept from the period when I was helping manage my mother's bills. When I laid them out in order, I could see it clearly. Over an 18-month period, there had been regular transfers out of my mother's main account. Not enormous amounts. $50 here, $200 there, occasionally $500. They went to an account with a routing number I did not recognize. I cross-referenced the dates. Most of the transfers had happened on days I knew Daniel had visited her. The second thing I found was a voicemail. After my mother passed, I had borrowed her phone briefly to notify some of her friends of her passing. I had not cleared her voicemail. About 10 days later, sitting in her house while we were beginning to sort her belongings, I found the phone in a kitchen drawer. I listened to her voicemails to see if there were any she had not gotten to before she passed that I needed to respond to. Most were from neighbors and old friends. But one was from Daniel, left about 6 weeks before she died, and it said something that made my hands go completely still. He said, in a tone I can only describe as careful and rehearsed, "Mom, I just want to confirm what we talked about. You're comfortable with the arrangements. Everything is exactly the way you wanted it. I just need you to remember that if Sarah asks questions, we don't need to go into detail. You said yourself you didn't want drama. This is the right thing. Call me back." I listened to it 4 times. Then I made a recording of it with my own phone held up to the speaker. I called Patricia the same afternoon and told her what I had found. She asked me to send her the recording and told me to keep the phone somewhere safe. She told me not to delete anything. She told me, very quietly, that things were beginning to look significantly different than they had a week ago. I was not triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I was devastated. Every piece of evidence I uncovered was also a piece of my childhood being revised. Every proof of what Daniel had done was also proof of what he had chosen. And I was still grieving my mother. I was grieving her, and I was also now wondering whether her final year had been shaped by a person she trusted in ways that did not fully serve her own real wishes. That wondering hurt in a way I do not have clean words for. But I kept going. The third thing I found was through a conversation with my mother's neighbor, a woman named Gloria who had lived next door for 22 years. Gloria called me to offer her condolences about 2 months after the funeral. In the middle of that call, she said something unprompted that stopped me cold. She said, "I hope Daniel is doing okay too. He was over there so much at the end. Your mother seemed, I don't know, honey, she seemed a little tired in a way I couldn't put my finger on. Like she was carrying something she hadn't chosen to carry." I asked Gloria what she meant. Gloria said carefully that she had heard raised voices from next door on at least 2 occasions in the last few months of my mother's life. Not screaming, not violence, but Daniel's voice, insistent and low, and my mother's voice sounding more resigned than conversational. She said she had not said anything because it was not her business, but that she had wondered sometimes whether my mother was fully at peace. I thanked Gloria. I sat with that for a long time. And then I found the document. My mother was a keeper of things, physical things. She had a filing cabinet in her bedroom closet that had been there as long as I could remember, with colored folders organized by category. Bills, insurance, medical, recipes, because she believed recipes belonged with important documents, which I always found charming, and one folder in the very back labeled simply personal. I had gone through most of the cabinet already. Marcus helped me. We were respectful and thorough. I had put the personal folder aside because I was not ready for it emotionally. When I finally opened it, inside was a letter, handwritten, in my mother's handwriting, which I would recognize anywhere. It was dated about 19 months before she passed, which put it before the period of her sharpest decline. The letter was not addressed to anyone. It read more like a journal entry, or perhaps something she had written to herself to remember. In it, she wrote that she was worried, that Daniel had been asking her to sign things she did not fully understand, that he had told her I was pulling away from the family and that I had said things about her that she needed to protect herself from. She wrote that she did not fully believe him, but that she was tired and that he was there every day and that she was afraid of creating conflict. She wrote the words, "I am not sure what is true anymore. I love both my children. I don't want to hurt Sarah. But I am so tired of fighting him on this." She wrote that she intended to call me and talk to me directly. She wrote that she wanted to tell me what had been said and find out the truth. She wrote, "Daniel keeps saying there is no time and that we need to decide now." The call she intended to make, I never received it. I do not know whether she was talked out of it or whether her health worsened before she found the courage to reach out. But the intent was there, in her handwriting, in blue ink, on paper she had folded twice and placed in a folder she kept in the very back of a filing cabinet, behind the insurance documents and the recipes. I brought that letter to Patricia. Patricia was quiet for a long time when she read it. Then she said, "Sarah, I think your mother's will may have been signed under undue influence. I want you to understand that this is a serious legal claim and that it will not be easy or quick. But I also want you to understand that this letter, combined with the voicemail, combined with the financial activity you have documented, creates a foundation that I think we can build a real case on." I told her to build it. What happened next was about 4 months of legal preparation. Patricia worked methodically. She subpoenaed financial records. She obtained my mother's full medical history from the months surrounding the will signing. She located the notary who had witnessed the signature and discovered, through the process of questioning, that the appointment had been arranged entirely by Daniel and that my mother had arrived without any independent legal representative present. She also discovered something that made my blood go cold. The land, the 40 acres outside the city that my mother had always said belonged to both of us, that my father had spoken of as a family asset, that I had assumed would at minimum be handled with my knowledge. That land had been quietly transferred into a limited liability company that Daniel had formed 8 months before my mother's death. The transfer had been done with a power of attorney document that Daniel had obtained from my mother during her period of greatest vulnerability. The land was no longer in my mother's estate at all when she died. It had already been moved, and because it was in an LLC, it was not governed by the will at all. Daniel had not just shaped the will. He had moved the most valuable asset before the will even mattered. I want to tell you how I felt when Patricia explained this to me. I want to be honest. I did not feel rage in that moment. I felt something smaller and colder than rage. I felt the specific pain of realizing that someone had looked at everything you trusted them with and calculated how to use it against you. I felt the years of Sunday dinners and holiday calls and my brother's arm around my shoulders in photographs, and I understood fully that all of it had existed alongside this. That the warmth and the calculation had always been in the same body, that I had only ever seen one half. That grief was very specific. It was not quite like losing someone. It was like discovering that someone had never quite been there. I went home, I sat with Marcus, I told him everything. He listened without interruption, and when I was done, he said very quietly, "Sarah, I have been waiting for you to be ready to see this. I am so sorry it took this." I asked him what he meant. He got up and went to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. He sat back down and opened it to the first page. In his careful handwriting, going back years, dates, and small notes and things he had observed, but never felt it was his place to push on. A comment Daniel had made at Christmas 3 years ago about my mother not needing to leave things equally because fairness isn't the same as equal contribution. A phone call Marcus had overheard in which Daniel had told someone on the other end that he was managing T. He situation. A birthday card my mother had sent us, one she had clearly written herself, in which she had mentioned she missed me and hoped I was not too busy to visit, language that felt unusual because I visited every month at that point, which meant someone might have been telling her otherwise. Marcus had been watching. He had not interfered because he respected me enough to let me arrive at the truth myself. But he had been keeping the smallest, quietest record, and now that record was another thread in a fabric that Patricia could work with. I could have been angry at Marcus for not telling me sooner. I was not. I understood. You cannot hand someone a mirror they are not ready to look into. The legal process moved forward. Patricia and her team were building the case for will contestation on the grounds of undue influence, and, in a separate action, were pursuing a challenge to the power of attorney used to transfer the land. Both actions were going to take time. Both were going to cost money. Both were going to require that I hold myself together through months of uncertainty, while Daniel, who had obtained legal representation of his own, acted as though nothing was happening. And this is where things became personal in a new way. Daniel called me about a week after we had filed the initial paperwork. His voice had a different quality than it usually did, not quite nervous but altered, like a frequency had shifted. He said he had heard from his attorney that I had filed a claim against the estate. He said he was hurt. He said he had not expected this from me. He said he understood I was grieving, and that grief made people do things they would not normally do. He said he hoped we could sit down and talk. I told him I was not going to discuss the estate outside of the legal process. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sarah, Mom wanted this. You need to accept that." I said, "I found the letter, Daniel." There was a silence on the line that told me everything I needed to know about his understanding of what that letter contained. He knew exactly which letter I meant. He did not ask me to clarify. He did not say what letter. He was silent in the way that a person is silent when they have just realized that something they believed was buried is not buried at all. Then he said, "I think we should talk in person." I said, "Have your attorney call Patricia." And I hung up. I want to be honest about how that felt. Part of me had expected to feel powerful in that moment. Instead, I felt tired and sad. I felt the weight of what it means to have to legally defend your right to what should have been yours. I felt the wrongness of a family that had arrived here. But beneath the sadness, there was also something else. Something that had not been there before the letter, before the voicemail, before the notebook full of Marcus's quiet, careful notes. I felt clear. I felt like I had finally stopped standing in the fog and could see the shape of things as they actually were. That clarity was not comfortable, but it was honest. And honesty, I had learned, was the only foundation worth building anything on. The following months were a grind. Legal proceedings are not dramatic. They are paperwork and waiting and phone calls and more paperwork. Daniel's attorney tried several strategies. They argued that the will was valid. They argued that my mother had full capacity at the time of signing. They argued that Daniel's relationship with her had simply been closer than mine in her final years, and that her choices reflected her genuine wishes. We let them make those arguments, and then we presented what we had. The medical records showed that my mother had begun experiencing mild cognitive changes approximately 3 months before the will was signed. Her physician at the time had noted in her file that she was showing signs of increased confusion and that major decisions should be approached with care. That note had not been acted on formally. My mother was still largely functional, but it was there, in black and white, from her own doctor. The voicemail was presented. The letter in her handwriting was presented. The financial records showing the unexplained transfers were presented. Marcus's written observations, organized by date and submitted as a supporting affidavit, were presented. Gloria, my mother's neighbor, gave a recorded statement about the raised voices and my mother's demeanor in her final months. And Patricia had found one more thing. In the process of reviewing the paperwork around the LLC that Daniel had used to receive the land, she found that the power of attorney document authorizing that transfer had a notarization date that did not match the physical paper's condition. The document showed creasing and paper aging inconsistent with its stated date. She brought in a forensic document examiner. The examiner concluded, with professional certainty, that the document had been signed on a different date than the one recorded. In other words, the document may have been backdated. That finding changed the tenor of everything. Daniel's attorney went quiet for 3 weeks after it was submitted, and then they came back with a settlement offer. I want to pause here and tell you something about what that offer felt like to receive. It was not enough. It was a fraction of what the estate and the land were worth. It was structured in a way designed to make me go away quickly and quietly. And for about 24 hours, part of me, the tired part, the part that had been grieving and fighting for months, the part that still felt the residue of all the years I had loved my brother, considered it. But Patricia sat across from me and said, "Sarah, if we accept this, he wins, not just financially, he wins the story. He gets to say his sister was unreasonable and then she settled and it is over. Your mother's letter gets sealed. The voicemail disappears. The backdated document becomes irrelevant. Everything that proves what happened to her gets buried. Is that what you want?" I said no. We rejected the offer and continued. 3 months after that, Daniel came to me himself. Not through an attorney, himself. He called my phone and asked if he could come to the house. I told him I would speak to him outside my home, not inside. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my office. I brought Marcus. Daniel came alone. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically much different, but there was something behind his eyes that was not there before. Something that looked like the beginning stages of understanding what he had actually done. Or perhaps it was just the beginning stages of realizing that it had not worked. I have genuinely never been certain which one I was seeing. He sat down, he ordered coffee. He did not look at Marcus, he looked at me. He said, "I want to fix this." I said, the time for fixing this was before the letter, before the voicemail, before the backdated document, before the LLC, before all of it. What specifically do you want to fix right now? He said, "I want my sister back." I looked at him for a long time. And then I said something I had been thinking about for months, something that I had written down in my journal at 2 in the morning and refined through dozens of sleepless nights until I understood what I actually meant by it. I said, "Daniel, you did not lose your sister. You spent years making a decision about who I was to you. You decided I was someone you could use, someone whose absence you could manufacture, someone whose inheritance you could take. You decided all of that. I did not make you do any of it. And what I need you to understand is that I am not angry at you the way you might expect. I am clear about you. And that is something I cannot undo." He was quiet. I said, "The legal process will finish when it finishes. But I want you to know that whatever the outcome is, I am not carrying this anymore. I am not going to spend the next 20 years angry at you, and I am not going to spend the next 20 years pretending none of this happened. I am going to live my life, and you are going to have to live with what you chose." He did not respond to that the way I might have expected. He did not argue. He did not defend. He looked at his coffee cup and then he looked at me and he said, very quietly, "I told myself you would be fine, that you had Marcus, that you didn't need it the way I did." I said, "That was a story you told yourself so you could do what you wanted to do." He did not deny it. We sat there for a few more minutes, then he left. Marcus and I drove home without saying very much. When we got inside, he made dinner and I sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, I did not feel the particular weight of protecting a version of my brother that had never been entirely real. It was gone, and in its place was something lighter. Not happiness, not yet, but space. Room to breathe. Room to be myself without the distortion of a love that had been taken advantage of for too long. The legal case concluded 4 months after that meeting. The court found in my favor on the will contestation. The will was invalidated on the grounds of undue influence. The estate was ordered to be distributed according to my mother's prior will, which had been filed with her attorney several years before the contested version, and which left the estate equally between Daniel and me, exactly as she had always said was her intention. The LLC and the land required a separate resolution. The backdated power of attorney was found to be legally invalid. The land transfer was reversed. Daniel was required to dissolve the LLC and return the property to the estate. He was also required to repay a portion of the financial transfers that had been documented during the years he had been managing her accounts. His legal costs alone had consumed most of what he had expected to receive. I want to be clear. I did not walk away from any of this unscathed. The legal fees were significant. The emotional toll was real. The process of going through your dead mother's medical records and financial history to prove that your brother was manipulating her is not something anyone should have to do. It left marks. I am not pretending it was clean or easy or satisfying in some tidy way. But I walked away knowing the truth. I walked away having stood for something. I walked away with my mother's actual wishes honored in a way that I believe she would have wanted. And I walked away having discovered, through the worst of it, that I was a person capable of holding herself together under enormous pressure. I did not scream. I did not dissolve. I gathered evidence, I found the right people, I stayed the course, and I let the truth do the heavy lifting. Daniel and I have not spoken since the legal process concluded. He did not reach out when the judgment was entered. He did not call. I did not either. There is a silence between us now that is different from the silences we used to navigate. Those old silences were full of things we were choosing not to say. This silence is simply the accurate distance between two people who have finally stopped pretending. Some of my extended family was upset by the legal fight. A cousin called me to tell me that I had torn the family apart. An aunt sent me a message saying that my mother would not have wanted this. I responded to neither of them. I had learned by then that the people who told me to keep the peace had never been the ones at risk of losing everything. Keeping the peace is easy advice to give when the cost of conflict belongs to someone else. I kept my mother's filing cabinet. I moved it into my own home office. The personal folder is still inside it, empty now except for the letter I had scanned and submitted as evidence. The original I keep in a safe at home. I do not look at it often, but I keep it because it is proof of something beyond the legal case. It is proof that my mother knew what was happening to her, that she was not fully fooled, that she was trying to reach me even from inside the tired confusion of her final year. It is proof that she loved me, that her intention, the one she expressed when she was thinking most clearly, was fairness. It is proof that the story Daniel tried to write over the top of her real story was not the true one. She meant for us both to have something. He took that from her too, not just from me, and that, of all of it, is the thing I carry with me most. Marcus and I bought a small house last year, on the edge of town, with a garden that I am slowly learning how to care for. Some of the money from my share of the settled estate helped with the down payment. I think of my mother every time I am in that garden. I think she would have liked the porch. I think she would have brought food and stayed too long and left the kitchen smelling like something warm. I think about who I was before all of this happened. The Sarah who handed her brother her trust year after year, who explained away the strangeness, who interpreted everything as good intention, who needed so badly to believe the story of her family that she kept herself from seeing the truth of it. I do not think badly of that version of myself. She was doing what love teaches you to do. She was giving the benefit of the doubt to someone she had grown up beside. But I am also grateful that I am no longer her. I am grateful that I know now what it feels like to be clear, to look at a situation and see it as it is rather than as I need it to be, to love someone and simultaneously refuse to be destroyed by them. I learned something about trust during all of this, not that you should stop trusting people. That would be its own kind of damage, but that trust is not the same as blindness. That loyalty does not require you to excuse what you are watching happen in front of you. That the kindest thing you can do for yourself sometimes is to stop pretending you are not already holding the evidence. I also learned something about family. Family is not the people you share blood with. Family is the people who behave like family. Marcus is my family. Patricia, who I stay in contact with, is a kind of family. Gloria, who came to the house with food after the judgment and cried with me in the kitchen, is a kind of family. Blood is a fact. Family is a choice. And some people make choices that forfeit the word. I do not know what Daniel's life looks like now. I have heard, through a shared acquaintance, that he and Priya are no longer together. I have heard that he has moved to a different city. I have heard that he does not talk about what happened. I feel very little about any of this. Not satisfaction, not grief, just the neutral fact of a life that went its own direction away from mine. My direction is this garden, this house, this man who kept a notebook for years, because he loved me enough to pay attention when I was not able to. These mornings when I sit with coffee and feel the specific quiet of a life that is mine, actually mine, not shaped by someone else's hunger, not distorted by someone else's needs. My mother used to say that the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. She said it like someone who had tested the idea against her own life and found it reliable. I think she was right. I think she knew she was right even at the end, even when Daniel was standing in her kitchen trying to build a world where the truth would not matter. It mattered, it always mattered, and the day I stopped being afraid of it was the day I started getting my life back. If you are carrying something like this, If there is a person in your life who has been taking quietly, rewriting quietly, managing quietly, and you have been explaining it away because the alternative is too painful to look at, I want to say this to you directly. You are not imagining it, you are not dramatic, you are not the problem. The evidence you keep finding is the truth trying to reach you. When you are ready to look at it clearly, it will still be there. And so will you. Sarah did not win because she was lucky. She won because she stopped protecting the story and started protecting herself. She gathered what was real. She found the right people. She let the evidence speak. And she refused to be rushed into a settlement that would have buried the truth along with her mother's real wishes. If this story landed with you, if some part of it felt painfully familiar, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you felt when she found that letter. Tell me what you would have done at the coffee shop. And if there is someone in your life right now who is quietly rewriting your story, maybe this video is the sign that it is time to start keeping your own record. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. It might be the most important thing you do today.